as well abroad, there's a rising expectation of what mining should contribute to development. So this is coming in the form of increased tension, increased regulations on mining. A lot of mining codes are being revised right now. Congo, Zambia, Tanzania, and there's a lot of addition of local content requirements. Here in Canada, we're seeing a lot of attention on the issue of local procurement in the context of impact benefit agreements. There's a similar development in Australia where for mining in the backyards, and local procurement is a key plank of that. When it comes to sort of the social license piece, we constantly cite this study by Daniel Franks that a mine that's can lose $20 million a week in lost production if it's stopped. So when it comes to risks for a mine, a lack of local procurement is a real risk factor. And if you see right here on this KPMG survey of Canadian mining executives just earlier this year, they found that social license to operate was the number 4 risk, even above political risk. So that gives you a sense of the magnitude of the risk when local communities aren't happy. And I guess as a general point, if mine sites can't demonstrate meaningful economic and social benefits for where they operate, there's going to be a greater chance of conflict and stranded assets. I think we've all seen that recently here in Canada, perhaps more on the oil and gas side, but certainly, communities that have felt left out of the benefits are not likely to go along with new projects. And I guess I'll leave lastly with what I told you earlier, that every country right now that's updating their mining code is tending to work towards adding local content. So most recently, Tanzania has put quite an extent. There's some issues with it. That's kind of what the pattern is, that local content requirements are quite arbitrary and over the top. But that's sort of where things are going. As I alluded to earlier, procurement spending is generally the largest payment that a mine site will make. This is some data from the World Gold Council. They surveyed their members on where their money was being spent in country, and generally speaking, across the board, it was 71% was to procurement. And when we look at a lot of companies, this sort of ranges between around 50 to 80% as money is being spent on procurement. So again, while it's really important, we look at taxation and both the rate of taxation as well as the transparency and tax evasion. Actually, procurement is a much larger dollar figure than taxes. So that's kind of the context of why we focus on it as an issue. And that kind of leads us to our question, some of the work that we're doing, which is to say, why, if we have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, we have the ESTMA regulations here in Canada, why, if we have a common way on reporting for tax payments and other impacts, such as wastewater and other environmental impacts, why do we not report in the same way for the single largest economic impact? So that's sort of where we come to with our work. So we started off a few years ago trying to get a baseline for how the industry was doing on the issue of local procurement. And we just sort of started off by looking at how the largest 40 companies in Canada were reporting on local procurement. So we obviously couldn't visit every mine site, so we could at least see what the reporting was for that issue. And so we looked at whether they were talking about local procurement at all. Were they talking about their programs? Were they mentioning a policy? Were they able to provide data that showed how much money was going to local suppliers versus international suppliers? So that's sort of where it started, and we came out with a report that looked a lot like this in terms of an overview of how the various companies are doing. And when we made this little checklist, we found a lot of companies wanted more check marks, and we saw that a lot of companies were kind of pushed and nudged towards trying to do more reporting on local procurement. And because of that, they had to put in place some back-end systems to make that happen. So we had a number of companies who started to reach out to us for advice on how they should do local, where they could turn to for advice on local procurement policies, what are the best practices, what are some case studies. So we saw that reporting really pushed companies in a really constructive way to care more about the issue. And we often use health and safety as a very similar kind of case study, where a lot of the improvements on health and safety really come from an increased attention to measuring, lost days due to injury and those kinds of things, really being, putting it at the heart of the company to make sure people know those figures. So we know that reporting really does drive a lot of issues, and that's why local procurement was one of the issues we focused on in that context. So we worked with the German development agency GIZ, which is funded by the German economic development, which is called BMZ. We created a reporting mechanism, or the mining LPRM. And the mining LPRM is essentially a set of disclosures on the mining industry that is similar to the Global Reporting Initiative and how it's structured. Essentially a set of disclosures that we're hoping every company will fill out. And its intention is to fill in gaps that are present in both the GRI as well as a multitude of other CSR and reporting frameworks that a lot of mining companies are using. We found that local procurement was really being touched on in a lot of systems and used by the mining industry, but in sort of one place all at once. And so that's sort of how we got to the. We had a global steering committee, which included representatives from all the institutions, who really went out of our way to try to bring in big voices from big entities representing each stakeholder. So the Tahltan Nation here, which of course is a major supplier of mining here in Canada, this Economic Development Corporation. We have the industry organization, ICM, as well as Anglo American as a representative of a mining company. So we had a large group of people to try to give us advice on, what would be practical, what would be useful for the industry. And the objectives of the LPRM are to improve internal management of mining companies when it comes to local procurement. Again, both to create benefits for host countries, also in their mind to increase social license. Second objective is broadly to get muted there. But
stakeholders.
Can somebody, there's somebody speaking in the background. Can you please mute yourself? If you're not muted and you're not a speaker, can you please do that?
I think we're back. The second objective is to empower suppliers, host governments, and other stakeholders with information they can use to target supplying opportunities. Right now, a lot of countries, the suppliers don't really know where to turn on even practical information, where mining companies' contact information is for procurement, things like that. And then on top of that, they don't know what mining companies are buying in what amounts. So it makes it more difficult for them to supply mining. And so we're trying to help the suppliers, governments, and everybody to work together on that issue. And then lastly, sort of the third objective kind of came out that wasn't necessarily a process, was to increase transparency around procurement. Because again, if procurement is the biggest payment type, that also means it's a giant risk for corruption, bribery, and other forms of problematic practices that can happen around any large payment spend. And so before I turn it over to Emily, I'll just sort of give this is a mini diagram, or showing kind of the idea that if reporting organizations for a mine site, whether that be the mining company themselves or whoever else is doing it, the reporting reports to these stakeholders, suppliers, governments, and these are the benefits that come out of that. So for example, local procurement strategies and better targeted training for education and supplier development initiatives. So that's the LPRM, how we got there, and I'll pass it to Emily right now.
Great. I'm just going to slide into view here. So diving in a bit deeper into the reporting mechanism that we developed, I just wanted to first kind of point out the resources that I believe Karen mentioned and shared earlier. But there is a 4-pager which kind of gives an overview of the project, as well as details and disclosures, as well as there's a much longer 80-page report Now it's only long because there is quite a big appendices, and we'll go through some examples that are included in the appendices for every single disclosure that we're going to describe here today. There is an example of how various companies are already reporting this information publicly, as well as the links between these disclosures and existing sustainability frameworks. So here, just as an overview, the guidelines of the reporting mechanism are for the reporting organization, whether that's a mining company or an organization that's operating the mine, to report on the local information. It's a mix of both quantitative and qualitative. I'll go through in more detail in a moment. And the main kind of data user or stakeholder that the company or EPCM is reporting to is their stakeholders and rights holders. And obviously these are kind of case specific and quite variable across different sites. And we're not prescribing where organizations should report. We are encouraging companies and EPCMs to focus on accessibility of information and look at their existing reporting channels. So maybe the annual reporting, maybe that is through your website. We'll show an example.
How are you?
Putting everything together.
No, I'm sorry, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
okay. So as I said, the focus is on very important because we
no, it's okay.
feel that things are bundled up into a national level or across all of companies. It's hard to break down and kind of generally the benefit, it's harder to see those. And as I mentioned, significant effort made to make sure that the information is accurate, updated, and accessible. So there are kind of 6 categories, and the first, they are required across all sites. This is basic information on local procurement processes, local procurement spend,
Emily?
diligence.
Emily?
Or, yeah.
Can I just get you to pause for a second? Your sound is cutting out quite a bit. And I'm wondering if everyone might turn their videos off temporarily, and it might help with the sound.
Great.
We have a lot more international call-in on this one. I think it's affecting it, so.
No.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let me know if it continues, and I will happily maybe my computer and see if that helps. Okay, so basically, as I was saying, the remaining 2 sets of disclosures are context specific, not applicable in all cases, and they focus largely on different incentives that companies can use about local procurement, for example, scoring methods, unbundling of contracts, etc., as well as the regulatory environment, which in some countries there is quite specific regulation or community agreements that sites have undertaken, and then in other countries this is not the case. Okay, so to provide you an example of what the disclosures actually look like, I have some disclosures from the 200 series that I was mentioning. And so this is focused on procurement systems. This is all qualitative data, looking at, getting companies to share, do you have a policy on local procurement? Yes or no? If not, does it fit into other policies, and how does this generally play out in terms of your internal management systems? Also, who is accountable to local procurement, which departments are responsible for the issuing, for your contractors to buy locally. So these are some examples of disclosures in the 200 series focused on procurement systems. In terms of procurement spend, this is the 300 series, and the main focus here is on first detailing the definition of local that is being used. This can vary quite a bit. Some companies have a definition which is geographic, so they're looking at local businesses as businesses located within the community. Maybe they're looking at local businesses in the province or at a national level and registered within the country. This can also include aspects around participation. So this could be focused on ownership or employment. And this is very much the case in terms of the regulatory environment in South Africa, for example. And then there is also the focus on value addition, so locally produced goods in most cases. So a good example of that is in the case of Ghana, where there's a targeted list of goods. So I think at the end of the day, we're just encouraging to explain about how defining local, particularly when they're providing data and numbers on what they're buying. So in the past reporting that Jeff was showing a bit earlier, a lot of the time we were finding some quantitative data on local procurement, but there were many times where it wasn't clear how local was actually being on this disclosure specifically. I will say that you know, for companies reporting in line with the Global Reporting Initiative or the GRI, the focus of the GRI and overlap with this information is here on the quantitative aspects, and the GRI requires companies to follow the geographic definition and provide a definition based on geography and include how they're defining that, as well as they push for a breakdown of spend. So for companies that are following the requirements of the GRI, you would technically be in line with this. Part of the longer report that I showed, we're trying to also lay out the other considerations, and from a risk mitigation perspective, sometimes there are other aspects that need to be considered around employment and ownership. That's very much the case for companies operating in Canada, for example, with Indigenous owned businesses. Also, we can come back and definitely ask questions about this, because I think around the providing numbers and quantitative, this can be one of the disclosures where there's a bit more discussion to have, and I would love to kind of do that in the Q&A. So as a tangible example, here is the reporting of the Oitogo mine. Jeff can provide a bit more context around this because he actually did have the opportunity to visit their site during the preparation of these disclosures. And here what you're seeing is a really interesting case and quite a lot of detail in terms of their local procurement spend. So on the left column, you can see a breakdown of all the spend families, and along the top row, you can see that they're defining local by geography, so South Gobi, but they're also differentiating in terms of ownership. So they're breaking down between the national and in-country. They're looking at foreign businesses that are registered in Mongolia and Mongolian-owned businesses. The interesting thing about this case is that they're going one step further and including a column around targets. And that is part of the Mongolia Community Development Agreement are negotiated every single year, and this is part of that process. For us, this is a really interesting example because reporting is not only kind of putting information out there and hopefully it's being used. In this case, this is actually a planning tool. This is the opportunity to sit down with stakeholders and say, well, it may not make sense or be feasible in the long term or sustainable in the long term to develop fixed plants and equipment in the South Gobi, but there are other items that make a lot more sense to target. And so this can kind of, you know, help with setting realistic targets around local procurement, and for policymakers to kind of sit down with all the relevant stakeholders and have that discussion about what can be prioritized. We recognize local procurement is important, but it doesn't make sense across every spend category. So this is quite an interesting and detailed example, and we can come back to this a little bit later. So I just wanted to provide a couple other examples of company public reporting on local procurement in line with the disclosures that we have in this document. So on local procurement policies, here's an example from Anglo-American. This was included in their sustainability report, this language here on the left, as well as they've included their local procurement policy on their website. So for us, this would be completely in line. They've clearly outlined what their local procurement policy is and how this fits into their strategy and where this priority is for them. In terms of the disclosure around major contractors, here's an example from Newmont, some language coming from their sustainability and external relations standard, talking about where and how they kind of prioritize local suppliers and what they do in relation to their major contractors. And last but not least, here's an example from the due diligence disclosure from Barrick, and this is from their supplier code of conduct, and this outlines, how suppliers are held accountable to due diligence processes and how the company kind of avoids problematic practices on behalf of suppliers. So as I said, this is all examples like this are provided in the appendices of the longer document. So for every single disclosure, you can see an example of how companies are already reporting a number of these different aspects. And that's true for every single disclosure. So I think that highlights for me that, none of this is crazy. I think it's just about the comprehensiveness of covering the issue. There are so many different sustainability frameworks that are discussing the issue of local procurement. Sometimes they're focused on the process side. Sometimes, like the GRI, they're focused more on the spend. We're trying to bring it all together and say, in terms of comprehensively covering this issue, this is what you need to be thinking about, and these are the priority areas in relation to best practice. Okay, I do have one more here just to show on the incentivizing disclosure. Again, this is not required, but something that's encouraged to consider is the relevance of non-scoring methods, for example. And this is an example from BHP Development Program and what non-scoring methods they're using. Here is how the data could be presented. Here's an example from Centerra Gold's Kumtor mine in the Kyrgyz Republic. And so they have a local procurement page on their website. And at the bottom of this page, you can see information on their strategy, their local procurement figures. You can see, and the different requirements. So for us, this is a really clear way to potentially lay out this information for suppliers and encourage different stakeholders to use this information. I'll hand it over to Jeff now to talk a bit more about implementation, and then we'll switch over to Q&A.
Great. Okay, so kind of that's having laid out what the LPRM is. I want to draw on a few points about where we see it fitting into things. One of the things when we started making this was that we didn't want the LPRM to sit on the shelf, and we found over and over that resources and tools for mining companies on local procurement, as with many other issues, tended to be sort of made and sit on the shelf as an 80-page toolkit that you can read. So we really started off with a multi-stage approach committee to try to think about how we could incorporate the LPRM into existing systems that are already being used by mining companies. So, for example, in the case of a lot of write local procurement policies. You know, we see the LPRM as a way to help consultants guide their local procurement policies that they write for companies, for example. So we, you know, we're not trying to be proprietary about this. We're trying to basically get this to people, including consultants, who can then take it. So that's the idea of sort of incorporating it within existing, you know, systems that are being in place by companies, whether they're local procurement specific or wider approaches to setting up management systems. Investors, on the other hand, are a key influencer of behavior. Maybe someone talking again. Okay. Okay, we'll start again. So for investors, they have a lot of influence on company behavior because, of course, they provide the capital. It's also a risk that mining companies can't demonstrate a very good job on local procurement. It's a sign they may have problems on the road, not just in local procurement, but in other topics. And so for investors, we've made a brief, which is going to come out very soon, on how they can use the LPRM as a way to measure company kind of. Can someone mute whoever's still up there? Microphone not muted.
Excuse me, is there somebody talking in the background that has not muted their mic? If you can please mute your mic, that would be really great.
No problem. It happens. Most webinars this happens. So,
I usually have control of it. I just don't today.
Yeah, no worries. So, like I say, the LPRM to us as a way that investors can whether companies are doing good things in local procurement. And for example, investors could basically require use of the LPRM as an example, a way they could use the LPRM to identify as good behavior. And then I think the kind of the biggest, in many ways, carrot that we're trying to offer the mining industry itself, the amount of money that is flowing into host countries on SME support and private sector support. I mean, there's no shortage of money. And even here in Canada, for example, there's a lot of money available for Indigenous businesses in terms of training and supply support. However, a lot of this funding is going to the market, or those businesses don't understand how the mining sector works, for example. And so, for example, we're trying to say, look, if you can take overseas development assistance and other aid money and make sure it gets to the right businesses, that'll help supply development efforts for companies in a way which will save money. So for the reporting mechanism, if we get more mining companies reporting what they're spending their money on in a broad sense, which types of policies they have in place, which supplier portals they might be working with, this will help steer some of these funds for SME support to actually get to be more effectively used. Sorry. I think you got it. Oh, sorry. And then last, so here's just a bit of a logic model kind of diagram which shows the idea that if you can get more information out there, these are the kind of ways that the information can be used to ensure better results on local procurement. So I think just to conclude here, and then I look forward to Q&A, and then essentially, the argument we're trying to make here is that if I'm just gonna can someone mute there, whoever's I don't know how to change that. Okay. Karen, is there no way for Krista maybe? I'm not sure who is the. I'm trying to find out who doesn't have a mute icon.
Yeah, I'm not sure who it is. There's Krista and Dorcas I think Krista just disappeared possibly. And Dorcas and Sergio are the only other two that had a mic on.
Okay, it looks like we're better for now. So I'll probably have a moment here. So essentially, you know, our argument is that if mining sites can be more transparent in their local procurement, that, you know, ultimately local procurement is going to increase. And we've seen that, you know, apparent ways with health, safety, and other topics. So we know that reporting and disclosure helps, you know, grease the wheels of local procurement. So that's the main kind of the message we want to leave people with. And also the idea that, you know, the LPRM allows companies to improve their social license to operate, better engagement with government and regulation, better abilities to communicate with communities, better trust building. You know, as Emily alluded to, I went to Mongolia. The fact that the OT mine was able to report in great detail allowed them to do a really good job of having trust from. And then lastly, I guess the idea that the LPRM is it provides a template of best practices on local procurement that kind of everyone can use. Not every NGO, not every company has to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch. So I'll leave it there. There's our website information and our Twitter. Look forward to Q&A.
Great. So I'm going to jump back in here and we'll start out the Q&A with questions from the chat. And then I will open it up to everyone else who's here on the call. If you just want to, instead of using the chat, if you just want to ask, you might ask questions, we can do that as well. So to start off with the questions that were in the chat, there was one specific question on what ODA stands for. I believe for overseas assistance, just so that's extremely clear. Data exists on the cost of conflict, so maybe Jeff will let you quickly address that.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, the cost of conflict is that there's a few angles here. One is that there's this sort of broad, the kind of intuitive fact that when mining companies face delays, it costs them money. And so I alluded to that one stat that there's not much in the way of stats not operating. So that's just an example of how much that costs. But I think on the procurement front, it's kind of interesting because if a company does not buy locally and that leads to resentment that causes a delay or a strike or something, that cost is kind of put in the bundle of community conflict. It's not actually put to the procurement budget. So you might have a case where a mining company will save $1 million on procurement by not buying locally. They'll be buying something cheap import from China, for example. So they'll save $1 million, but that $20 million cost of delay, for example, is sort of kept in a separate accounting book. And that's something that's very interesting, that, you know, people don't necessarily link the saving procurement costs.
Then there was another question on how do you calculate value addition, what a product is. This does
Emily?
But some examples of how this is being done is, there's quite like a, yeah.
Do you want to maybe take the screen share off so we can come all on the screen, and maybe that will also help with the sound? I really apologize for this is not happened to this extent before.
It's not the first time we've dealt with it, so it's okay.
Okay, great. Is that better?
Yeah, right now.
Perfect. Okay, so for value addition, one of the more time-intensive cases is, you know, there are certain countries determining a good. You actually have to register, and the country government actually determines what a local good is, and they have kind of a list of businesses, and this is an example from Kazakhstan, I believe. So, but I'm going to go back and share some examples of how countries have actually done this. The case of Ghana with the targeted list of, that's been more of a challenging case, and I think the challenges of implementing the value addition from a government standpoint is really providing a clear set of guidelines on how that will be done. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Jeff, in terms of how do you actually calculate value addition, and what are the different ways that people are doing that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the obvious point is that if something is imported, it's not as beneficial for the local economy as something made in country, right? I mean, yes, technically, a good could be made in country from imported components, and it could just be putting it together at the last minute. But ultimately, that's kind of where we want to shift people's idea towards, is to say, when you say locally procured, do you mean locally procured import, or do you mean a locally procured manufactured good? And obviously, the more companies can buy locally manufactured goods, the more they're creating more benefits, the more they're creating goodwill. So I think that's sort of where we're moving it towards. But as Emily said, it's extremely difficult to kind of break down what is value addition. And in some ways, it's probably better that mining companies don't go really crazy on trying to do that, because it can be distracting and it's counterproductive. So I would say the best way is to find out some of those key attributes of, is it locally manufactured? Is it imported? Are the employees, for example, local employees? For example, is everybody working for the firm a local employee? That's the way you can measure, how much is being added in country as well. So.
And maybe to add to that point, Jeff, can you just clarify? Someone was just asking the difference between the in-country versus national in the case of what you told us.
So in the OT case, there's two firms would set up a branch office, for example, or it's a foreign owned one. So a Caterpillar parts dealer would be in that category, whereas a Mongolian national supplier would be someone who's actually a Mongolian-owned business. That's sort of the key difference. Money going to the Mongolian suppliers as opposed to international corporations, the more goodwill that's basically being created. So that's kind of the difference.
Do you know how Mongolian-owned is actually defined in that case?
I don't recall right offhand the exact number and how they've done that, but it's basically through registration and whether it's a Mongolian person owning it as opposed to a foreign entity.
Okay, so ownership criteria.
Owning it.
Okay. Great. So then there was another question on the LPRM and SDGs and alignment between these mechanisms. I'll kick that off, and then maybe Jeff can add some points. Basically, yeah, I think that there's lots of alignment in the longer document of the LPRM. In one of the first 10 pages, we have a whole section talking about alignment with the SDGs, particularly SDG 8 on economic growth. The Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment did a great study which we contributed to, which is called Mapping the Mining Sector to the SDGs, or those words, a bit later. And that study really went every SDG where there was opportunity for the mining sector to contribute, and local procurement was obviously highlighted a number of times under that. And so for companies looking to demonstrate that they're advancing their practices around local procurement, and they're doing that in a sustainable manner, this is definitely one of those tools that can support them to do that. Anything else to add?
No, I'm good.
Great. So then the last question before we turn it over to anyone here on the call that just kind of wants to jump in with a question is someone was kind of asking more about how the LPRM deals with the social side. And so I'm wondering, Jeff, if you can talk a bit more about the impact of a reporting mechanism in terms of broader social outcomes and improve business practices, development, country.
Well, I mean, I think that there's a few aspects of the LPRM that really focus in on that. So one is obviously the 400 level disclosures I talk about a supplier code of conduct, anti-corruption policies, and whether you actually have training available for suppliers. So, you know, it's a new area. There's some companies who are starting to do more work on supplier codes of conduct. The Mining Association of Canada just came out with a model supplier code of conduct as part of the TSM system. And so, you know, we're trying to, with the disclosures, push companies more to thinking about that, how they can improve the social of the suppliers, because, you know, we visit a lot of mining countries where the suppliers just don't have anything in place in terms of basic, you know, everything from tax payments and formalization to health and safety. So we're trying to get mining companies to act as a bit of a lever for social performance increase or improvement by suppliers. And I think, you know, all to say wider, what we're trying to do is get mining companies by focusing from locally procured to locally manufactured, as well as looking at sort of local, you know, getting companies to split up local into what is really close to the mindset and what is national, as opposed to just referring to national as local, which is honestly what most companies do. We're trying to make companies have a better understanding of the social impacts they can create with their procurement spend. Right now, I'll give a tangible example. We've had a case. There's one case, and I won't mention the mine itself, but there's a mine in Canada which has very high figures for local procurement, and I've seen them brag about it in social media about how much money is going local. However, they're not breaking down that local into what is locally manufactured, whether there are local employees. And so this one mine in question has horrible social community relations problems. I mean, really a lot of protests and that kind of thing. And it kind of shows that if you have problematic figures and data and you believe them, you know, it's making a blind spot. So, you know, we're trying to do is improve the level of nuance on the data to actually factor in these social impacts at the local level.
Great. So maybe just turning it over to the rest of the group that's on the call here, and maybe you didn't have a chance to put your question in the group chat. Any other questions about the reporting mechanism, local procurement in general, any specific information you're trying to get? We're happy to recommend any studies that we know of, or communities that you could access, organizations, institutions you could access for more information.
So yes, if you have a question that you haven't asked yet, you can just unmute yourself, maybe come on camera. That'd be great.
This is Jan. I just have a comment. I think this is very important work. And I commented on the social side because I've seen it work very well. You can line this up with social components, and it's very synergistic.
Most appreciated, Jan. Thank you.
All right. Did anybody have any other questions? All right. Well,
I have a comment. I was very surprised you showed this table of all the mining companies and the boxes that had been ticked off. I was really surprised that there were many empty boxes there of companies that I would never have suspected to have an empty box there. Any comments on that?
Yeah, maybe can you? Let me see if I'm just gonna bring up that for my own. Taking a look at it. Yeah, I mean, there's a few points there. One is that I'll make a few general comments. This is that slide I showed was the Canadian, was Canadian companies. In Canada, it's interesting. There are more companies in Canada, I would say, reporting on this as a rule, largely because of the Indigenous issue. So because of the impact benefit agreements and the increased attention on that issue, a lot of companies have got ahead of this on thinking about these figures and spending and providing data. So as a rule, I would say, you know, if there's an Indigenous community involved and there's an IBA, it's definitely a push towards reporting more. You know, definitely the bigger companies, I mean, the bigger the company, the more likely they have the resources to do this. I think that's a general rule. The bigger the company, generally speaking, the more ticks. Companies from OECD are much Australia, Canada, the UK. It's actually ironically not so good. Not there on average. The American companies don't report as much as Canadian companies or Australian companies, and then companies from China, India, Russia. I mean, there's a real drop off in terms of disclosure across the board. So, but then the other thing I would say is that you don't need a lot of resources to provide this information. I think there's a bit of a misconception that only big companies can provide this information. But we've seen a number of smaller companies who've got only one mine site, and they provide all the information very clearly on their website or in a report. I mean, the Kumtor mine is in Kyrgyz Republic. It's a pretty good example of it's a big mine, but it's Centerra Gold, but it's not Anglo American or Rio Tinto, but very comprehensive information portal on their website for everything from supplier requirements and that kind of thing. So I think it's not really particularly problematic. I think where it does act as a challenge for some mining companies is if they have nothing in place in their software for procurement in terms of being able to classify something as local, they have to do a bit more work to get there. But for companies who already have that, which is most of the bigger companies do, it's more a matter of kind of compiling and presenting the information than it is about creating new systems.
Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate here that this study specifically was not looking at site level data. So this is company wide. Now that we're kind of the reporting mechanism, we're starting to look at site level information, and it's quite varied within companies in terms of what they actually have by each site. And it's not necessarily the case that if they don't have any information for one site, they don't have any information for all sites. So there are some cases, as Jeff was alluding to, sites in Canada, for example, because of the IDA that exists and the specific agreement, they've actually developed out the website and public information quite extensively on the issue of local procurement, but that's not true for their other sites that they own. If you're interested to look at that slide in a bit more detail and look at the companies that were covered, it was the top 40 global mining companies and top 40 Canadian mining companies. That information is on our website. I included the link in the group chat, but also reach out if you're trying to find it. Any other questions from anyone else on the call?
Emily, I'm just curious, is this guidance just put out for folks to be able to improve the reporting on their own sites, or is this something that companies are able to submit their data to you, or like a mechanism for you compiling all of that?
I can answer that question. So essentially, this is not meant to be like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative of creating, a big secretariat and groups to collect the data and present it. It's meant more, as you kind of alluded to, it's more about empowering companies to do better reporting. There's a few reasons for that. One is that the data is so context specific, and you can't really compare a local procurement figure from one country to another. So there's a lack of utility in actually comparing the data like that. So there's not really a lot of point of kind of compiling the data unless all the mine sites in one country, for example, have agreed to define local the same way. Now that's actually something that would be quite exciting. Is if you had a country that had, say, 4 or 5 mine sites, and they all chose to define local as in within 100 kilometers of the mine, for example, and then national, you could then compile all that data and make an interesting report that would push performance, I think. But generally speaking, it is, as you say, more of a tool to help mining companies. For us, what we're doing right now is we're assessing, we're doing a little bit of a comparison of how mining companies are reporting now compared to the LPRM, and we'll be reaching out to companies about sort of where they sit. So what we're really more interested in doing in terms of our kind of time and effort is to kind of identify leaders and kind of provide them information, and then find companies who could use a bit of support and provide them some feedback. So that's sort of where our kind of role as a sort of, not a secretariat, but I guess as a support office is.
Yeah, and I would just also add that, because we recognize that, a lot of companies do feel a reporting burden, there are already a multitude of initiatives focusing on sustainable best practices, etc. You know, we really felt that it didn't make sense to develop a separate organization that's going to collect data. It's just too too expensive in terms of dollars, but also labor intensive. So our main focus has been to make these disclosures for us, the focus was Global Reporting Initiative and making sure that they align with the existing requirements of the Global Reporting Initiative. If you look into the disclosures, all the key terms are defined in most cases using the same definitions as the Global Reporting Initiative. The focus was very much on easy integration for companies into their existing commitments and reporting frameworks. And over time, we're looking forward to working with these different organizations and initiatives to try to build out their disclosures around local procurement and their focus on local procurement. So that's kind of the approach we're taking is not trying to become another separate initiative, but integrate more comprehensive reporting on the issue of local procurement within the existing systems in the sector. There was a question that did come in, so before I continue to provide time around the room, there was a question around preferential procurement, and is it something that we've seen where all other things being equal, a company is willing to spend a bit more potentially for a local business? And I would say yes. We've heard that a number of times. This is not typically something that would be public information, so this would not be information you could find on our website, but there are many companies that we've talked to over the years that would definitely say that the percentage does vary, but there are definitely companies that would say that yes, all other things being equal, if we can trust the quality and if they can deliver the quantity we need, and it's slightly more expensive, we would still consider a local supplier because we recognize the importance of that, whether it's coming from a social aspect, from wanting to make sure that they're contributing to the local economy, risk mitigation. There's a variety of reasons that companies are considering this. Any other questions from the group?
Yeah, it's Andy Reynolds here. I hope you can hear me okay. I have a question about the linkage with host governments, with national governments. It would seem to me that once you get expenditure data, the economic development agencies of national governments should be able to analyze that and figure out some multipliers for the overall economic benefit. Have you had any luck yet tying up with governments to achieve that kind of analysis? Because it seems to me that it would be quite useful to the mining industry to be able to describe the wider economic benefits and what they spend locally.
So I can start off that with the Mongolia. So definitely in Mongolia, well, the OT mine, it wasn't using the LPRM. They were basically, for all intents and purposes, providing all the information included. It was very clear when we talked to Mongolian stakeholders the information to better understand where the target supplying opportunities. So we did, for example, see the fact that, and this speaks to what Emily was talking about, these community development agreements, they're renewed every year. Therefore, they were able to say, okay, this year we're going to target this good, for example, and next year we'll target this good. So we have seen it in practice, and certainly when you have a government, a relatively strong government like they do in Mongolia, both federally and at the provincial level, they do have some capabilities. Other countries, we're trying to do that now. We're actually talking to stakeholders in Argentina and Zambia in particular about this same idea of, can we kind of help the government, maybe through the EITI process or something like this, actually get regular data from companies and use it in their own programming. It's quite difficult. I mean, it does take a minimum level of capacity. So one of the things we realized early on was that we had to make a system that would have value even if the government didn't do anything with the information. We wanted to make sure there would be value for other stakeholders the mining companies themselves, chambers of commerce, suppliers, because we recognize quite sadly that a lot of governments just either don't have the capacity or the will to move on this. And so we want to make a system that would have value regardless. But absolutely, you're absolutely right. That is kind of the long-term goal, is to empower governments to better understand these systems and to use the data with their own planning.
Great.
Great. There was a question that came in around how replicable is this to the oil and gas sector. I'll start off, and Jeff can add if needed. But basically, I would say it's quite replicable. I think that for us in developing this, a big focus was making sure that we had all of the key stakeholders at the table and involved in this process. And so it was just not really manageable for us to also take on oil and gas in the first phase. I think that, there's definitely been interest in a lot of stakeholders asking, like, how can we replicate this? We don't have a concrete answer on timeline or when that will happen. But I think that there's potential. I would say that if you're trying to do it at a national level or with specific stakeholders, I think that would just be a dialogue with companies and industry and different associations to make sure that all the information makes sense, or maybe there are a few other disclosures that need to be added or disclosures that need to be tweaked to be relevant. I think that you can do this on a micro scale instead of trying to do a global initiative as well. But it's just about having everyone at the table in kind of potentially starting with reviewing these disclosures that have been developed and seeing what ones are relevant, what ones are not relevant, what additional considerations need to be made.
Yeah, there's very little in the system that actually wouldn't be completely suitable for the oil and gas sector. It's just as we alluded to earlier, we were so focused on getting buy-in from the beginning and kind of building that as we went that we didn't want to cast the net too wide in stakeholders. So as Emily alluded to, a good process might be for somebody to take this and work with some of the major oil companies and IPCA and a few other groups and say, okay, well, here's what we have. What do we like? Maybe what we would change. But as with all these things, if you don't have buy-in, there's not a lot of point. So we really wanted to bring in that from the start. So I guess the message is stakeholder buy-in from the beginning is a lot easier than presenting them something that then they have to sort of regurgitate. Well, also regurgitate. I think that people just don't like being told what to do. So better something.
Just on the oil and gas, I am aware of another group called Equitable Origin, I think. Have you come across them?
Yeah, that brings them down. Go ahead.
I was just saying they have some guidance on standards and whatnot for performance in various areas as well. And they focus on energy and oil and gas and other forms of energy. So they may have some synergies there. I'm just not sure that they have a whole suite of indicators. They just give guidance, I think. So worth a look.
Okay, we'll look at it. Thank you.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think I'll just take the time to thank you both for giving us this great presentation. I do apologize, and hopefully, we can get a decent recording out of it. I don't know how much of that was captured, the delay or whatever on the recording, but
No problem.
thank
We
you.
we run webinars as well for the World Bank, so we know we have the same same challenges with and there's nothing you can do when someone's talking. You can't make it. So yeah.
All right. But thank you
very much for the opportunity.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. This is great.
All right.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.